Today is the announcement day. Today, Nikon finally announced this mysterious retro ZF camera.
Hurrah! It's been a long time coming, I have to say, and we're very excited that it's here. We are looking forward to seeing this camera in the flesh, but until we do, here are the specifications, price, and where you should get it from. Hint, it's Grace of Westminster right now.
All right, so let's start with the sensor. It's 24.5 megapixel sensor, basically very similar to the sensor on ZX II, but it's not the same.
It's not. And it is, just for clarity, a full frame sensor. So we got that, which is great. It does have an X-Speed 7 processor, so same processor as the Z8 and the Z9, which is very cool indeed.
All up to date. Then we have -10 EV autofocus in low light. We also have largest auto area AF, which basically covers the whole sensor, and it is larger than the coverage on Z6 II and Z9 and Z8 cameras. We are now covering area of 89 by 96% versus 78 to 83% on Z8 and Z9 and 80 by 80% on Z6 II.
Very exciting indeed. Now, the other new feature of this camera is the fact that it has a black and white switch. This means that you can go directly into monochrome mode with the flick of a button.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool because now you have a video mode, you have your standard color mode, and black and white. Now, black and white can be also set to two different modes. Your standard one, what they call it flat monochrome, and now we have this very high contrast monochrome, which they call deep tone. And imagine that would work very similar to black and white film with a red filter also, so that will make your clouds to pop quite a bit more.
Very high contrast, so great if you love shooting black and white. It's something that people used to talk about with the DF back in the day, so really nice that they've added a switch to make it nice and easy to transition from color to black and white there. Now we also have our touch control screen, and the top panel is actually made of brass. It does also have a little window to show you your F number on the top.
It's slightly larger than on Nikon ZF. It also feels more robust than Nikon ZF. However, the flippy screen is basically the same on both cameras.
Still a flippy screen.
Exactly.
Flippity-doo-dah.
Flipping screen.
Some other features include starlight view, backlit autofocus, and subject detection in manual focus. So if you have an AFD lens, the older AF style lenses with aperture rings, or even manual focus lenses with a chip on them, if you've done that yourself, talk to me about it later, then you can get subject detection in manual focus, which just ups your game a little bit.
Yeah, so imagine you doing a portrait and it's suddenly that your little square thingy is right on the eye if you have eye detection. And if you assign 100% zoom to one of the buttons, let's say for me it would be okay, then you can quickly zoom in, make sure that the eyelashes and eyeball is sharp, and then go back and take shots. So that should improve your overall manual focusing quite a bit. So if you got manual focus, make sure they're cheap, as Becky mentioned. So let's say recent Voigtlander lenses, they're fully cheap. And if you got a bunch of AFD lenses, while they won't autofocus, they have a chip on them, which is quite useful.
Exactly. Now we've also got up to 14 frames per second in RAW. We do have 30 frames per second on this camera in JPEG only, but it's considerably fast, bearing in mind that earlier iterations of our retro cameras were designed to take your time and slow down. And I think 14 or 30 frames per second is not too shabby at all. Now, this camera actually also has pre-release capture mode, and that means that you can start taking the pictures before you've actually taken the pictures, up to 1 second before and 4 seconds after you've pressed the shutter release button.
Yeah, so all those features will come with improved autofocus speed. While it's not Z8 and Z9 performance, it's still better than Gen 2 versions of Z6 and Z7, as far as we know, and that's set to be determined once we get the camera in our hands. Now, the first in Nikon cameras, we now have pixel shift shooting. Probably not the camera that I want this to be implemented to, but effectively it's a newest feature and we expect it to be implemented in other cameras with a higher resolution sensors. But what it does is basically it will allow you to take several shots of the same subject, assuming the camera is on the tripod. You have options to shoot 4, 8, 16, or even 32 shots. It's take a high-res shot using vibration reduction on the sensor, effectively moving the sensor around. Then you upload everything in the software, something like Nikon NX Studio, and it will actually create a one raw file out of it. So very high resolution file. If you are studio photographer, if you are, let's say, still life photographer, or even landscape photographer and like to print large, then I guess that's one way to handle a 24.5 megapixel sensor.
That's very true. Now, there are some other additional things that they've added. We've got portrait impression, we've got skin softening like we had on the Z8. We also have a new, for portrait photographers, rich tone portrait mode. What does rich tone portrait do?
Well, effectively, they say it's picture control depicting skin details in rich tones, suppressing white clipping, retaining details in rich area. So I would call it a flat mode for photography.
Yeah.
But that's basically creates a nice neutral file for you to be worked on in a post-processing software like Photoshop or whatever you use.
Now, we were told that this will be added to the Z8 and Z9 in a future update. You've also got a magnesium alloy camera, so it is more sturdy. It is dust and drip resistant. And as we mentioned before, you've got a brass top plate there with all the lovely tactile knobs and dials too.
Speaking of mechanical shutter, the lifetime of the shutter is approximately 200,000 cycles, which is very similar to Z6 II cameras.
Exactly. Now for our videographers, there are some video improvements here in this camera. You can record up to 125 minutes of recording, even in 4K.
So in full frame, we can record in 4K 30 frames per second, and it's 125 minutes, so effectively 2 hours or so. Now, it can also record in 4K at 60 frames per second in DX mode.
That's right.
And in standard mode, it will only record up to 50 minutes. And then you have a high temperature mode.
Hot.
What we've noticed in the Z8 firmware update, there was a new change to high temperature as well. So in the high temperature mode, it can record up to 125 minutes. Now, Nikon ZF, surprisingly, again, it seems like a camera for videographers, which is surprising to have this retro format for this camera, but it is the first camera that have a shutter priority video for Nikon. So effectively what they say is you set the aperture manually to whatever you want, and then you can set your ISO to auto as well as your aperture to auto. And that helps you maybe if you're shooting indoors and you need to set your aperture to artificial light sources so you won't get flicker, but also if you're shooting in rapidly changing lighting situations where you still want to keep your shutter speed set, but you want your lighting to be balanced out a little bit. So again, we assume that this will be implemented into other Nikon cameras as well.
We can hope. There are also audio improvements. So for those audiophiles who have perhaps not liked the previous audio capabilities on earlier cameras, we now have 24-bit linear PCM at 48 kilohertz.
Fantastic. Now, in terms of storage, it takes 2 memory cards, 1 SD, 1 micro SD. It takes NL15 batteries, and it has a tiny little grip built into the camera, which should improve your handling on the go.
Now, the price is... and the sales start date is... So if you'd like to get yours pre-ordered, then you can do that from Greater Westminster. Obviously, if you're in the UK or Europe, you can also pre-order from us if you're anywhere else in the world, but you may want to order it from your local retailer instead.
And later today, do join us for fuller coverage of these announcements in our Nikon Report. It will be out later today. We will have all the discussions and thoughts on this release that we will share with you.
Yes, we will.
See you soon.